Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond. So today's topic is morphic resonance. And this episode is going to be based off of the theory that was first posed by Rupert Sheldrake in 1981. And I coincidentally came across this topic like 4 years ago when I found myself at a talk by Rupert Sheldrake. And at the time, I really had no idea who he was. And the talk was about ways to go beyond consciousness. So it was definitely like something a little bit different. And that's how I discovered Rupert Sheldrake, who was a natural scientist. He was at the University of Cambridge studying plant development. And pretty early on in his career, he was observing how auxins are responsible for the formation of plant structure. And this led him to come up with this theory of morphic resonance, which, to summarize it, this is how he always puts it, which I really like. It's that the laws of nature are more like habits. So he speaks a lot about how scientists, like modern scientists, in our empirical ways, we view physical or the laws of nature as being something that has just always existed, has always been there, something physical and innate, and everything else kind of exists on top of this plane of laws. But he argues that instead, there are morphic fields that guide the forms of nature, and structures in nature are molded by things that occurred in the past. So all organisms have a morphic field, and this is influenced by all previous similar organisms and also present similar organisms. So he describes it as a type of memory that exists in the natural world that is cumulative from the past to the present on the basis of similarity. And these resonating morphic fields is what guides the development and existence of nature.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll get into this later, but in terms of this memory that he speaks of, could this also be interpreted as evolution, like this idea of inherited information?
So a couple of things. Firstly, I have to say that for our listeners, if you want to find out more about the specifics of the theory, I would really highly recommend listening to his podcast, which is called Navigating Consciousness with Rupert Sheldrake. And as I was listening to this and learning about morphic resonance, of course, I also thought about evolution, because it's all about how nature has evolved over time. And he does touch on this, and he did explain how there is an extended theory of evolution that is different to neo-Darwinism, which is like the classic theory of evolution, which most scientists currently believe in. And this takes into account epigenetics. And this is a huge factor, which is related but slightly different to morphic resonance. So epigenetics is the ability for post-translational modifications of DNA to be inherited, and this can lead to more variety in the traits that can be inherited.
So if you have like some sort of like traumatic event, or even things like in your environment, such as pollution, this can cause like methylations to your DNA, and this can either be inherited or not.
Yeah, so it's a way that the environment can shape the genome, and that these environmental factors that influence the genome are then passed on into generations. And so it's essentially a way for the environment to shape future generations. And so, yeah, the new theory of evolution takes epigenetics into account, and also the ability for organisms to shape their environment. So it's not unidirectional, it's bidirectional, which we also spoke about in our evolution episode, about how, like, as humans are interacting more with their environments and building up their environments, we're also having essentially more control of our own evolution.
And we also highlighted that amazing aspect of biology in our episode on biomimetics and bioinspiration, because there's so much focus on trying to create these materials that have these bidirectional communication system between the biology and the material and the technology.
Yeah. So morphic resonance is similar to this new theory of evolution, but it encapsulates even more. So evolution can be like a subset of the effects of morphic resonance.
So is this morphic resonance, how is it different to evolution? You mentioned this morphic field.
Okay, so I think the difference is that morphic resonance involves interactions within and between organisms, whereas evolution focuses more on like individual organisms and their environment. So if we're in a specific habitat, we'll evolve to get those to maintain the traits that are beneficial, like we'll have thicker skin if we are in the cold habitat. But morphic resonance is about also behavior, and it's more about the collective. It's not only about individuals. So if a generation learns something, then it can be passed on to future generations because you have a similar morphic field that resonates with one another. So firstly, it's a different scale because I'm going to explain this more, but it's more about like the collective species evolving as one rather than like tribes maybe evolving differently, or with evolution there can be like divergence or convergence based on the environment, but with morphic resonance the way that it plays out its effect is based on the similarities of the morphic fields. Yeah, I'm going to go more into some ways because the problem with the theory is it's been largely dismissed by most scientists, and people are extremely skeptical of this theory. It was interesting, though, because I was listening to a talk by Rupert Sheldrake where he said that when he was working at Cambridge, nobody agreed with him. Everybody shut him down, and he eventually got kicked out of academia and hasn't really been able to re-intercept this world. But he went to India for a bit to write his book and was speaking to some of his friends there who were Hindus. And he said that as he explained to them his theory, they were very unimpressed and said that this is exactly what our teachings imply, just a sort of different version of it. So he came to develop the theory through his study of plants, but eventually found out that it was actually very similar to some Eastern philosophy, which I also find interesting because a lot of Eastern philosophy is rooted from observations of nature. And like we like to talk about on the podcast as well, I think the whole world is very centered around our empirical approach to knowledge and puts science, modern science, on a pedestal in terms of how we can come to conclusions about what we know and how the world works. But there are also other ways to interpreting the world. So that's why I do find this theory really interesting to think about. But of course, people have attempted still to empirically prove it. And I think this is quite interesting because it requires some creativity because it's such a difficult thing to prove. As is evolution, for example, which is still a hypothesis and hasn't been necessarily proven.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you before we jump into the experiments that they tried to carry out to prove Rupert Sheldrake's theory. So what's his background? Was he focus research? Was it biology or like, because you mentioned plants?
Yeah. He was studying plant development, like how plants develop to take their forms, their shapes. And he was studying the role of auxins, which are a specific type of molecule that influences their development.
Okay. Because you then mentioned his Hindu friends and how in Eastern philosophy, there's parallels with his ideas and this focus on observing nature. And for me, when I was reading about his theory and his ideas, I have to agree, I am quite skeptical and I have a lot to say about that. But also, if you ask me to suspend my belief and think about his theory in a non-scientific light, like as I've mentioned, I'm a big fan of Wittgenstein and his rules of language. And I really believe that, if you can't judge an artwork from a scientific lens and you can't judge religion with like an artistic lens. Like each field has their own rules that you can abide by. I do science, but I also believe in God. And I don't think these two like excluded each other. And so it depends on what lens you want me to view morphic resonance. Should we look at it from as a scientific theory, or should we look at it from a philosophical or theological theory?
Well, that's where I have to kind of disagree with you, because I would say all. Because I do see philosophical and scientific theories as being comparable. The only difference is how you choose to prove them, like the evidence that you use to back them up. And I think morphic resonance can be both. Like there are philosophical arguments for it, but there's also limited empirical evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is a good point. There are different ways of arriving at logic and truth. So, yeah, with philosophy, I would say that it's mainly logic. And then with science, it's mainly empirical. But then also with science, I feel, Karl Popper and, a hypothesis has to be testifiable, whereas I don't think this is.
Well, okay, so yeah, I'm not fully convinced by the empirical evidence. I personally really like the theory of morphic resonance intuitively, and I think it's an interesting one to be further tested. And I think it's just, I'm drawn to its uniqueness and the ability that it has to encapsulate so many different things that occur in nature. It kind of like a unifying theory, but not necessarily in like a over idealistic way, just in a way that it can actually be applied to many situations. So some things that he's mentioned that I've been leading up to quite a bit too much are learning in animals, including humans. So this is really interesting. Of course, as neuroscientists, we do a lot of work on rodents. There have been multiple groups in Harvard, in Edinburgh, and in Melbourne who have looked at how rats learn, specifically a spatial navigation task, so the Morris water maze, which supposedly tests memory. And they tested rats learning this over 50 generations of rats over 20 years and showed that over time, basically, it got much easier for the rats to learn. And it wasn't necessarily hereditary, so it's not necessarily epigenetic, because the rats that weren't direct offspring of those who had previously learned also learned more easily. And the same thing was done in chicks. They did an experiment where they exposed chicks to an LED light, and then they made this stimuli aversive by giving an injection of an aversive chemical at the same time that would make them feel nauseous, I believe. And over generations that weren't necessarily genetically related, the chicks started to find light aversive. So that's kind of the idea. And another thing that I agree with less, but it's what Rupert Sheldrake uses, is he believes that human IQ works in the same way. So over the past decade, people have really improved in IQ tests by, I think, about 30%. And he says that this is not an improvement in intelligence. It's simply an improvement in our ability to take the tests because of morphic resonance. So I think that's more weak evidence, but something that made him also think of this was a couple of his friends sharing with him that doing the New York Times crossword puzzle was much easier to do later in the day than in the morning, which of course, yeah, could be because of so many different reasons. But he really wants to test the idea that, Wordle, the game, where you have to like guess the word. Yeah. If you can get the data of everyone who's done Wordle throughout the day, and also you can do it across time zones, with like starting from Australia all the way to America. And he really wants to test if people would improve on that over the day, just because the human species, like the collective consciousness, is learning how to do this task, which is also something I should mention, that the theory of morphic resonance is very similar to Carl Jung, the psychologist's theory of the collective unconscious.
Yeah, I was gonna bring him up later on. Super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I think these are all like evolution, collective unconscious, morphic resonance, they're all kind of different versions of each other. Yeah. But I think the problem with morphic resonance is like it doesn't fit, like you said, under a specific area of knowledge. Like, is it science? Is it philosophy? I think it was meant to be science, like biology, but it's ended up being kicked out of that world, unfortunately. Anyways, in terms of learning, another really interesting thing, I think this evidence is stronger. So, an experiment that has been done a few times is trying to test how well people memorize characters in foreign languages. So, they've used Japanese and Chinese characters. And the idea is that humans over time, because we've been learning these languages, again, as a collective, so like humans as a collective have been learning Chinese for hundreds of years, but not all of us, obviously. So they will take participants who have no prior knowledge of these languages, and they will show them characters from that language and also characters that look like they're from that language, but they're not actually that language. And they test like which ones they're able to recall more easily. And 3 different studies have shown that for Japanese and Chinese characters, people do remember the actual Chinese or Japanese characters, not the fake ones, better. These are people who don't know these languages at all. And yes, you can argue that they've been exposed a little bit to these languages. Like there might be an aspect of familiarity because we do live in a globalized world. Like we do see Russian, Arabic, Chinese, Japanese characters here and there every so often. But I still think it's very interesting that there was actually a statistically significant effect of people being able to learn these languages. So the idea is that if part of the human race does something, another part of the human race and in future generations will be affected by this as well. And it's sitting in this kind of collective unconscious.
Yeah. I wonder if perhaps you could attribute that to like development in the sense of like with the crossword puzzle, with the example of the Chinese characters, you know, we're in a society that's like a certain level of like fast-pacedness. There's a certain amount of information flowing around, not in terms of like exposure that they have seen characters, but they're just used to having like requiring to have a certain level of intelligence and ability in order to navigate our society. And therefore, that's why as a collective, now we're at this state where we can potentially differentiate fake versus real characters and potentially being able to do the wordle puzzle, even though I understand that it's within like the same day time frame, but yeah.
I see what you mean. I think for this, it doesn't apply because they were showing them real and fake Chinese characters. And technically you shouldn't. I mean, I literally watched a really stupid video the other day of someone asking which one is Chinese, and they had like Korean, Japanese, and Chinese, and everyone was like that one and got it completely wrong, like non-Chinese speakers or people who didn't speak Asian languages. So anyways, these results are quite in contrast to that.
Yeah.
Because it's like this ability to recognize what's familiar to people who are like to human beings, but that are not you. But then what you said, I think is really interesting because it could be that our brains evolve in a relatively short span of time to take in information in a specific way in which we have made our world. But again, like how we were speaking about the difference with evolution, the difference is it's transmitted not through genetics. If that is the case with evolution and learning of languages, then it wouldn't make sense that somebody in Brazil who's never been exposed to Chinese could adopt this way of taking in Chinese, you know?
Yeah, it is interesting. I don't know what to say in response to those results. I do find them surprising. But for example, as you mentioned, a lot of his other theories have been difficult to prove. And for example, he has this idea that we can sense when other people are looking at us, like from behind us. And they did try to test this. And the problem was when it was people that didn't believe in his theory, tested this, they found a non-significant result. And then when people who did believe his theory tested it, they found a significant result. And so there appears to be this clear experimental bias problem. There also appears to be this confirmation bias. And then Sheldrake's response to skeptics was saying that the negative expectations influenced the way that the results came out. And so obviously from a scientific perspective, eliminating data on the basis that they depend on whether you're a believer or not it's not very scientific. And I also think it parallels a little bit with the problem of psychedelic research in the sense of like, it's really hard to have a control because it's quite clear when there is an effect or not.
Wait, in terms of psychedelic research, what do you mean? Do you mean that with psychedelic drugs, your expectation of the effect influences your experience?
Yeah.
But if you're doing psychedelic research, you're giving people the dose in a blind manner, so they don't know if they're getting a placebo or the drug.
Okay, sure. But don't you think that if it's a large enough dose and nothing happens, don't you think the patient or the subject would know that they're in the placebo group?
No, because you might still have effects if you have like a placebo effect.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay, you're right. Anyway,
but something that did pop in my head was I did see that there have been studies as well that did these learning kind of experiments and showed that morphic resonance also correlated with some personality traits, such as introversion. So I feel like what you're saying with the expectation or believer, like people who believe in the theory versus people who don't, it's definitely a personality influenced thing because it's how open-minded you are, all of your beliefs are shaped by your personality and your experience of life as well. But a lot of it is shaped by your personality. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it had different effects on different people based on their personality. Yeah. And also another interesting thing is one purely biochemical evidence for morphic resonance, which I honestly found very interesting, is that so when you synthesize new chemicals, you need to crystallize them. And according to morphic resonance, you would hypothesize that over time, new chemicals would be easier to synthesize because they'd be more likely to crystallize because they have the same morphic field. So they essentially learn over time and over generations, if you can call it that, how to crystallize. And this is true. Chemicals are more easy to crystallize, and they have a higher chance of crystallizing now than they used to. And it keeps happening with newer and newer chemicals. If you look at the timeline of chemicals and when they were synthesized.
Okay. And that has nothing, like the structure is the same. Like that has nothing to do with potentially the structure now is more favorable to being crystallized.
So I'm not going to lie, I don't know the full details. But yeah, as far as I know, the way that they looked at it was purely based on time, not the complexity of the structure or anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. But overall, what I really like about this theory of morphic resonance is its ability to cross scales. So like I was saying about the crystallizing chemicals, but it also applies to learning of collective groups of animals. And he also speaks about how it could be applied to like rituals and rituals that are done by humans. I know that this also reminds me of like innate things that animals do, like migration of birds. And a friend of mine recently mentioned to me the butterfly effect and how it applies to morphic resonance. And that's like the idea that there's a species of butterfly that migrates across North America, I think, but it takes generations for the migration to occur, which also reminds me of the tree migration that we spoke about in our very first episode in individuality, where trees migrate, but in groups. So it doesn't happen like they don't physically move, but over time, the forest will look like it's moving because new trees will form in a sequential spatial manner that looks like migration. And anyways, so I think that also means the theory can be tested across many different scales. I think it will continue to be a challenge to do it empirical tests of this because there are just always going to be so many other factors that are involved, and there will always be other explanations that people will use, like epigenetics and genetics and evolution and psychology and other things. But yeah, this idea of scales reminds me of the concept of fractals, which are this mathematical geometric patterns that are characterized by what is called self-similarity. And self-similarity is that if you zoom in onto a fractal object, it looks similar or exactly the same as the original shape. And so, yeah, I think morphic resonance can be a self-similar process that shapes the world and shapes nature across many scales simultaneously.
That's really cool. I like that it does cross several different scales and how you related it to fractals. That's a really good comparison. It kind of, for me, it sprung to mind one of our favorite artists, Hilma Klint, and how she was really in tune with her spirituality, but also geometry and evolution. And you can see that in her artwork. Like there's definitely evidence of fractals. And yeah, I do like the idea of being open-minded to things outside of the realm of just empirical evidence, and that there's different ways to interpret the world. And I do think it is positive to, in general, be more open-minded than closed-minded. So yeah.
Of course, also for the progress of science, because as a neuroscientist who's interested in how information is stored and processed by the brain, which leads to studying memory and learning, this hypothesis is really intriguing to me as an alternative hypothesis of memory storage, because people generally believe in neuroscience that memories are stored in changes at the level of individual synapses, so connections between neurons. But there's still so much, like, it's just so widely believed, but like, why is that more true? Yeah, we know synaptic changes occur, and we know that in like prohibiting these processes can disrupt memory, but like it's still not really strong evidence, to be completely honest. Like memory engrams, people look at, oh, these specific cells light up every time the animal does this. Well, is that proof of memory? Like, no, not really. And just because you block one molecule, which is involved in like thousands of processes, and one of them happens to be long-term potentiation of synapses, you say, oh, LTP is responsible for memory. Like there is still so much that does not like strongly prove, which is why I think we shouldn't dismiss alternative hypotheses that should continue to be tested, like morphic resonance.
I definitely agree with that. And that parallels a lot with how I feel about dualism versus materialism, and that a lot of scientists think, oh no, we've cracked it. We know when the person is sleeping or awake. We know when the pain receptors are active or not. And therefore, we know about the mind and consciousness, but they don't. It's all like you're very close, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah. And this also reminds me of a way that Rupert Sheldrake said it in one of his talks, was that he did mention people believe memory is stored in the brain, but according to my theory, like memory is not necessarily stored in the brain. Instead, the brain is a way to tune in to the world and tune into the memory that already exists within the world itself. And I do like this idea of like the brain as a tuning machine. Like that you're tuning into kind of a radio station, which we talked about in our episode about noise in the brain, and how our brain is just this noisy thing that is able to take in information and that's shaped by the noise and then output things. And that is honestly how I view the brain as a neuroscientist at the moment. Maybe my thoughts will evolve over time, but
of course,
yeah, it does kind of fit that concept.
Yeah, as we always say, our opinions are subject to change.
Yeah.
And that thing that you said about our brain being tunable, that also reminded me on our episode on color, where you said, like, are we just a vessel for the experience of color to lay upon? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same idea there.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, we got pretty passionate there.
I love that.
Yeah, I do like that. But I think it's a perfect place to wrap up today's episode. And do let us know your thoughts on morphic resonance. And we will put all of the links to further resources over on our website, neuroversepod.com.
Yeah, if you like this episode, please feel free to share it on Instagram, Twitter with your friends. We really appreciate it. Thank you for listening.